There are 4 candidates for the question, who or what is most responsible for Macbeth's downfall? Obviously, at number 1, we have the witches. At number 2, we have Macbeth. Number 3, Lady Macbeth. And number 4, the one you might not have considered, fate itself, or if you like, God. Because in Greek tragedy, the hero always tries to overcome their fate, and it is an impossible task. Fate always wins. So let us begin with the witches. On the face of it, they do seem to have a supernatural power. They seem to summon Macbeth. They ask themselves where they're going to meet on the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. They have foresight, foreknowledge of where he's going to be. When he arrives and they finally meet, they have decided on the weather. In thunder, lightning, or in rain, it appears that they can control the elements with their supernatural power. But can they control Macbeth? Let's look at the evidence. They say to Macbeth that he is great, that he is the Thane of Glamis, the Thane of Cawdor, and soon to be king hereafter, although they don't actually tell him when. They don't say it soon. Well, yes, that deeply affects Macbeth's thoughts. Banquo says of him, "See how our partner is wrapped withal." And later on, Macbeth will say, "Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair?" Because his mind immediately turns to murder. He talks about stars hide your fires, symbolising God's light, and he doesn't want God to see his impure thoughts. So, is that because the witches are controlling his mind, or have they just put something in front of him which he does all the work to? Because remember, he could simply wait. Shakespeare makes it quite clear because Macbeth himself says, "I might as well just wait. Chance will have him king without his stir. He can just wait for fate to happen. He'll become king hunky-dory." So on the face of it, it looks like the witches do not directly control him. Now, some people decide that the dagger, the imaginary dagger that he sees before him, could have been placed there by the witches. But Macbeth calls it a dagger of the mind. In other words, he takes responsibility for that vision. He doesn't blame the witches. He doesn't see a supernatural power. Now that's important because he goes back to them later after he's had Banquo assassinated, and he doesn't ask them about this at all. He doesn't accuse them of encouraging him to kill Duncan. Not a bit of it. He only asks them about the future. In other words, in Macbeth's mind, the witch's power is foresight. It's knowing what the future brings. It's understanding his fate. He certainly doesn't think the witches have controlled him. And that is a pretty good guide that it ain't them. Also, there is no evidence in the play that they ever ask him to do anything. They don't give him any instructions other than beware Macduff. Pretty good advice, really. They tell him that no man born of a woman is going to kill him. A bit tricky, but that's what the Fates did in Greek tragedy. They always came up with riddles. And of course, Macbeth would have known about Greek tragedy. That was part of a gentleman's education. And so he would know not to simply trust the witches' prophecies as meaning he had to behave one way or another. Another way that people blame the witches is they say, well, hold on, Lady Macbeth says, "Come, you murdering ministers that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here." She is invoking supernatural powers. Those could be the witches, but come on. They don't actually appear on stage, do they? We don't see her visibly becoming unsexed. It is a metaphor. Lady Macbeth never talks about becoming supernatural herself or having any influence over supernatural powers. It's just, if you like, wish fulfillment. So there's no evidence at all that the witches control Macbeth's actions. They influence his thoughts by predicting the future, always accurately, never lying, just telling him what he wants to know. They hope that they will create chaos for all sorts of reasons I won't discuss here, but they do not make him do what he does. And so this brings us to Macbeth himself. Is he responsible? Well, when the witches are waiting for him the second time, they say this: "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." In other words, it's not them that's wicked because they don't commit wicked acts. It is Macbeth who's coming. Macbeth is the wickedness that comes into the play. A drum, Macbeth doth come. He is the evil one. So the witches think it's all Macbeth. Let's review the evidence of the play. What happens when Macbeth hears the prophecies we've already seen? He immediately starts to think of murder of Duncan. It's his desire. He recoils at the desire, but then he thinks about it some more, and what turns him off is the idea of failure. Later on, he's going to say to Lady Macbeth, "What if we fail?" And she says, "We fail, like who cares? If we fail, at least we died doing something we wanted to do." But before that, Macbeth is obsessed with the idea of failure. And he says, "I have nothing to prick the sides of my intent, save vaulting ambition, which leaps and falls on the other." So what he means is, I've got an intent to be king. And the thing that's going to drive me to grab that for myself rather than waiting is ambition. But I am the horse, my intent is the horse, and ambition has got spurs, which is going to make me jump. But when I jump, I'm going to fall over that hurdle. I am going to fail. What worries him is that his ambition alone is not enough. So what does he do? Well, he writes a letter to Lady Macbeth. He calls her my dearest partner of greatness, a partner in a patriarchal society. He's not saying, "I am your dominant and domineering husband." He's saying, "I am your equal partner in this venture to get what the weird sisters have promised thee. They have promised you," he says to his wife, to Lady Macbeth, "that you will be queen and you will become great." In other words, he is working on Lady Macbeth's mind in the same way as the witches worked on his. He knows that she is ambitious. He knows that she is grief-stricken at the death of their child. He knows that that is recent. We know that because she's still lactating. She wants her breast milk turned to gall, so the death is recent. She is grief-stricken. He knows that her role as a woman in this society is to provide him with an heir, and she has utterly failed. They have no children, as Macduff points out at the end of the play. So Macbeth manipulates Lady Macbeth by sending the letter because he knows her thoughts will immediately turn to how Macbeth can become king. Shakespeare also makes that really clear to us because Macbeth arrives on stage to see his wife just after she's finished reading the letter. Shakespeare's making the point that there was no reason for Macbeth to send the letter in advance of himself other than to get her to think in advance. Like she's not really getting the information that more quickly. So what is the advantage of Lady Macbeth thinking about this in advance? She is going to use her ambition and her grief and her lack of influence as a woman to think, what is the only thing that's going to fill the void in my life? Becoming queen. Macbeth needs to kill King Duncan so that that can happen quickly. And my thesis here is that Macbeth knows his wife is going to do that and knows she's going to throw her full support behind this. And what will she do? She will give Macbeth more than ambition. She will come up with a plan of how to do it, which is exactly what she does. Leave this great business in my dispatch, she says. Let me do it. Leave all the rest to me. So she is the ultimate planner. Now, that doesn't come from nowhere. Macbeth knows his wife. He knows that she's the ultimate planner. And she comes up with a master plan. So they're going to drug the guards. The guards will be asleep. They're going to frame the guards using their daggers. These are the daggers that will be the murder weapons. They're going to be covered on blood. They're going to take this blood and put it all over the grooms like they're guilty. There's no DNA test. There's no lie detector test. There is, you guys look flipping guilty. It's a done deal. The flaw in her plan is she originally decides to kill Duncan herself. She is the one who's going to stab him. No one would ever suspect a woman. Macbeth would be somewhere else invisible, and no one would ever suspect him. But she says, I couldn't do it. He looked too much like my father as he slept. This is delivered, by the way, in soliloquy. And in a soliloquy, characters speak their innermost thoughts. So this isn't a lie. It's not an excuse to get Macbeth to carry out the murder. It's genuine. She would have killed Duncan herself had Duncan not reminded her of her father. This is a massive clue as to Lady Macbeth's inner nature. She wants to be full of direst cruelty, but it just isn't in her, as that reveals. But it's also a clue about fate. Patriarchal society has meant that women cannot supersede male power. And it's proved in the play. You know, Lady Macbeth tries to get this status of being queen, and her reward is madness and death. Women are denied power. That is the whole point of the witches. They have no power, they're ugly, they've got beards. In this patriarchal society, they'll never find a husband. They have no wealth and they have no beauty, and they're therefore outcasts in society, and they choose to find power in another way. So Shakespeare here is cunningly linking fate, God's plan, to social conditions, the conditions set up by people in society. Shakespeare is cunningly suggesting that society itself is causing this fate. So one possibility now isn't that it's just Lady Macbeth who's responsible, but also the patriarchal society that values male violence. Remember the beginning of the play, and Macbeth unseams the enemy from the nave to the chops. So he literally stitches him from the belly button all the way up to the chops up here. You can only do that in close combat. You couldn't do it with a sword. The leverage would be impossible. You need a dagger. And so Macbeth has come in close and personal. He has enjoyed the slaughter. He's bloodthirsty. He is in many ways a psychopath. But society values this because his role is military. His role is to defend the country. And these acts of bloodthirsty murder are therefore a sign of brave Macbeth. Well, he deserves that name. But we could substitute the word brave with the word bloodthirsty or psychopathic. And Shakespeare plays with this idea. Is it society itself which causes the problem? Well, let's look at Macbeth's actions and decide whether society pushes him this way or whether it is his own inner nature. So let's start with his objections to killing Duncan. He says, I can't kill Duncan because he's a relative of mine. He says, God approves of Duncan. The angels will be trumpet-tongued, protesting at the death of Duncan. I simply can't do it. Lady Macbeth, however, tells him that he must. She manipulates him by bringing up the evidence of their dead child and saying that she herself would have killed her own child rather than go back on the promise that he made. She accuses him of cowardice and being unmanly. Well, this idea of how a man has to prove himself through action and bravery is a social construct. And so we could argue that she uses the influence of society to control him. So both Lady Macbeth and society are to blame. However, if Macbeth has sent the letter to Lady Macbeth deliberately to get her to plan the murder, to persuade him to kill, so that he's got more than ambition to get him to carry out the dastardly deed, then he is also responsible. So a sophisticated answer will say it is a combination of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, but not the supernatural. Because here we would be arguing that Macbeth would be a bloodthirsty killer even if it weren't for the witch's influence. Is that true though? So what happens when Macbeth goes back to the witches a second time? They give him all these prophecies about how no one's going to kill him and he doesn't have to worry unless Birnam Wood marches up Dunsinane Hill, and Macbeth thinks, well, all right, I'm going to be fine. But what does he do? He says, well, I'm in blood stepped in so far, returning were as tedious as go o'er. In other words, hey, I've killed enough people now that it's pointless going back. Like, I'm going to hell anyway. I might as well keep killing. So that is not the witches encouraging him to do that. It is his own bloodlust, his own psychopathic nature. Now let's look at his choice to kill Banquo and his attempt to kill Fleance. It's no coincidence that Banquo's ghost appears to accuse him, not Duncan's. In other words, although after killing Duncan, Macbeth says, I've murdered sleep, Macbeth hath murdered sleep, Macbeth shall sleep no more, it isn't actually Duncan that drives him to madness. It is Banquo's ghost who appears. It's Banquo's ghost that drives him to madness. In fact, later in the play, we find he's sleeping perfectly well. Lady Macbeth is the one who's not sleeping. She's the one who's sleepwalking with a taper. Macbeth is never woken up by this, is he? Why? Because he said, Jesus, I'm not going to spend my nights getting up while you fanny about. I'm going to have a decent night's sleep, sleeping on my own. That's why he's not there. That's why her gentlewoman is there. That's why the doctor arrives and Macbeth is not there. He's sleeping. Instead, it is the murder of his friend Banquo that terrifies him. This is the moment where he talks about being stepped in blood so far. He never says, oh my God, I've gone against the great chain of being. He never says, oh my God, I've gone against the teachings of God. These things don't particularly worry him. His greatest regret is the amount of blood he spilled already, the blood of his friend. Now there is another aspect to the downfall, which is actually, we've got the moral downfall of becoming a killer, committing regicide, going against the great chain of being, blasphemously going against God. But let's rewind. Could Macbeth have got away with it? This is important because in the source material, Holinshed's Chronicles, Macbeth does get away with it. Macbeth kills Duncan and he stays king for ages. In fact, Banquo helps him. So the act of regicide is not a downfall in the source material, nor is it here. Macbeth would have got away with it had he not killed the grooms, because when he kills the grooms, that creates suspicion. Macduff says, why for did you so? And suddenly suspicion is aroused. But even then, everybody else but Macduff turns up to his banquet. So, one lone person, Macduff, isn't going to cause Macbeth losing his kingship and having a downfall. Oh no. What causes the Thanes to change their mind about Macbeth is the ghost of Banquo, whom Macbeth decided to kill. Thou canst not say I did it. Never shake thy gory locks at me. So every single Thane hearing that doesn't think he's talking about Banquo. They all think he's talking about Duncan. And so ironically, and this is where fate comes in, ironically, it is a confession. I killed Duncan. Duncan's ghost. Stop shaking your gory locks at me. That's what every Thane hears. We know that's not what Macbeth means. That doesn't matter. That's what is the turning point. This is when Thanes start to flee and go to England and join up with Malcolm. In other words, Macbeth's actual downfall, in a tactical sense, is the murder of Banquo. Who is responsible for the murder of Banquo? Not the witches. They don't tell him to do that. Not Lady Macbeth. She suggests that nature's copy is not eternal and plants the idea of killing Banquo, but they don't discuss it. In fact, Macbeth says, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck." He keeps that plan entirely from her. And this is Shakespeare's way of saying that was Macbeth's plan. He is totally responsible. And so, in my conclusion, that is what I'm going to argue. Macbeth carries the ultimate responsibility because he wanted it at the beginning. He is the one who pivots with the killing of Banquo because that creates the conditions of his own failure. That creates the conditions of the rebellion where he is going to be defeated. And why is that so important to Shakespeare? Because this is a propaganda piece, this play. It's being commissioned by King James I, who is not being universally welcomed as the King of England. You already know about the Gunpowder Plot and the attempt to get rid of him by the Catholics, but also there's a huge number of nobles who would be hoping that their man would be the one to become king. They'd like to get rid of King James. And so the play says, look, don't do it because you will fail, you'll go insane, your soul will go to hell, but most of all, remember, you will fail. And so it's really important to attach that failure, that downfall, to Macbeth himself, the individual. As a final point, the individual speaks in soliloquy. Shakespeare created this voice of the individual. He created the soliloquy because it's part of his dramatization that people are responsible for their own actions. This was a dramatic departure from previous plays. A generation before, which were morality plays. And in morality plays, characters represented ideas. They weren't real people. Part of Shakespeare's genius is that he recreates real people with psychological issues which we begin to understand because of their soliloquies, where we're exposed to their innermost thoughts. So if we return to Jacobean views about the role of God, Macbeth goes against them. He decides God is an idiot. God has written the tale, a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing. This is the tale that Macbeth himself is living. So you have now revised an enormous amount of the play. If you would like to dig into grade 9 interpretation of the themes of the play, this is the video you should watch next. I'll put some better music in.